and move to some other part of the world that's desperate for the work that they bring and desperate for the money that they bring. And I've watched this with Inco, International Nickel. And of course, one of the things that's happening with the BP in the Gulf is that they're heavily involved with George Soros and Obama, with Petrobras down in Brazil.
I heard that there was a transaction or something. There was some investment like weeks before.
Yeah, what happened was that Soros bought into Petrobras, which is the government-run oil industry in Brazil, and he did it 2 months before they announced that they discovered very, very large deposits of oil in deep waters off the coast of Brazil. And then shortly after that, Obama advanced $2 billion credit to Petrobras to develop this oil. But of course, their problem is that there is a very limited number of deep water drilling rigs, most of them tied up in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, what better way to make them available to Brazil than to declare a moratorium on drilling in the Gulf? So what you've got is machinations within machinations going on here. And it goes back to Heilbronner's argument about these multinationals effectively not being beholden to any nation and therefore any people, because they simply pick up and move if they don't like the way that you're running them or telling them to run.
Well, listen, I want to talk about the EPA for a minute. I think it's very important because I was always under the impression as a younger person that the EPA was honest, was a do-gooder, was here to protect us, etc. If the EPA can declare carbon dioxide a toxin in December of 2009, and if the EPA can allow BP to put Corexit, millions upon millions of gallons of Corexit in the ocean, people are so sick and so many animals have died, how come they're able to do it? I don't get it. I thought they're supposed to protect us.
Well, one of the things that is that if you want to, one of the difficulties with democracy is you have elections, and you're answerable to the people. So you have to find a way to get around that. And of course, one way that you do it is that you function and operate through bureaucracies, through executive orders, and of course that's one of the things that Gordon Brown did it in Britain. He simply bypassed the political processes completely. And one way you do it, of course, is expand the number of people working in the bureaucracy. Brown added 3 million people to the civil service, as they call it in Britain. And, of course, you're seeing that with so many of the jobs that are being created under Obama. And so if you can bypass the legislative process and do things through the bureaucracy, you can effectively control. Now, I wrote an article almost 2 years ago saying that Obama didn't care about getting cap and trade through. Yes, he'd like the revenue from it. It was going to bring him $500 billion in revenue. But what was more important was the controlling of the fossil fuels and the CO2 and so on. And when the EPA ruled that, and I agree with you, by the way, and this is always the problem with anything, when it's set up for particular reasons, but then it evolves over time. And I think what we need to do is every 2 years go back and look at whatever we've set up and say, is it doing what it was originally intended to do? Has it drifted? Is the drift logical? If not, let's push it back to what it was intended to do. The EPA is one of these examples. But anyway, the EPA maneuvered the Supreme Court into making a ruling on CO2. And Justice Scalia said, look, to say this is a pollutant or a toxin is just ludicrous. It flies in the face of logic completely. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court did rule that. And, of course, it was precisely what the EPA wanted, because once it was ruled a pollutant, then they had total control over it.
Look what's happening to the light bulbs now. They're telling us we have to use mercury-laden light bulbs. Is that absurd?
Yes, and by the way, there is a solution to that problem, because liquid or light emitting diodes will replace all light bulbs if government would get out of the way and if it was allowed to develop. You see this, by the way, people can drive around, see the traffic lights are different. And if you look at the traffic lights closely, you'll see they're quite different in their structure and form because they're no longer a green piece of glass with a regular light bulb behind it. They're made up of light-emitting diodes, and they burn virtually no power. They give off virtually no heat because they're not burning that power, and they don't burn out. And the problem has been that they haven't been able to produce a white light which has the full range of color spectrum in it up to this point. But they now have a white light emitting diode available, but bulbs made of it are about $45. And yet, if we switch to those, probably reduce the power consumption by at least 50%, because most of the power we use goes to lighting in that form, and of course it would reduce the heat output. But anyway, back to the EPA. Once they had CO2 declared a pollutant, then the next phase they had to go through, and again, this is because of the way the Founding Fathers set up the Constitution and so on, and the amendments have been made since, was that people could challenge what was going on and what the EPA were proposing, and the EPA had to prove that what they were doing would do no harm. And so there were several submissions made legally, and I happened to be part of one of them. And part of what I put in, Kim, and you'd love this, is I said, look, I want power of attorney on behalf of the plants to vote for an increase of CO2.
Talk about that, because I think people are under the false impression about CO2. Say what it is.
Well, CO2 is one of the greenhouse gases. It's less than 4%, but it's essential to life on the planet because where we breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2 and other gases, the plants breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. And so without CO2, there are no plants on the planet, and therefore there's no oxygen, there's no life. And at 385 parts per million, which is what they're claiming the current level is, that's the lowest in the last 600 million years. That over the last 300 million years, the average CO2 in the atmosphere has been between 1,000 and 1,200 parts per million. And so they're essential to life. Or it's essential to the plants and therefore to life. And one of the things that the reason we know about the 1,000 to 1,200, by the way, is work by Craig and Idso and his son Sherwood, who've tested all kinds of plants and showed that they grow 4 to 6 times more vigorously and use less water with more CO2. And commercial greenhouses around the world are pumping in those levels of CO2 to increase their productivity. And so at 385, CO2 atmospheric levels are very, very low. If you go down to 250, plants start to die, and at 150 parts per million, the plants basically die. And so this argument that CO2 as a pollutant is only based upon the false claim that it's causing global warming. In fact, it's absolutely essential to life on the planet. And so we submitted this as part of the brief, and I think it's sad to me that we had to do this even in a legal brief, almost tongue in cheek, saying, well, we want to vote on behalf of the plants. And of course, what happened yesterday was that the EPA rejected all of the legal challenges. And of course, what's interesting to me is that they are the ones that did the review and rejected the challenges. It should be an independent agency. But they looked at it and said, no, these are all wrong. We're going to go ahead with it. And what you've got now is the EPA have the authority that Lisa Jackson, Obama's appointee, and her staff can go into any operation and say, you're exceeding what we consider acceptable levels of output of CO2, and we're shutting you down. And it's authoritarianism without control by our representatives and